the morning time. I'm appreciative that a number of you can make this time, so it actually worked out pretty well for me. I could meet any time, and I have yet to be able to figure out how to do this class without some lecture or instruction. I like for you to have the ability to interact or ask questions. So again, avail yourself of that Q&A box at the bottom if you have any questions. This morning I sent out an email to everyone. It was actually an email that I sent out individually to one of the students in this course. It was about attendance credit, and it was also an inquiry about Tuesday's exam. We have an exam forthcoming on Tuesday that will cover content in Business Plugin 1, Business Plugin 3, Business Plugin 5, Chapters 1 and 2. So you'll want to read that. I think there's kind of a misconception about attendance credit, and hopefully I think that may clarify it for you. Attendance credit is an incentive only. It is not a rubric item. It does not have a weight on the rubric. It is an incentive that reduces the weight of your final. And the better your score, the less it helps. It's designed to help students that are not performing well. And even then, it's a negligible amount of points overall. You know, if you score a 60 on the final exam, attendance credit will add 1.2 points to your final grade. So there is some credit there, but it's just not a huge amount. And if your goal is, and this student's goal was to maximize her points earned, if your goal is to maximize your points earned, better to attend or view every meeting, do well on all of the categories, focus on doing well in all the categories, the SimNet work, the Connect work. I'd like to point out to everyone there's no reason at all for everyone not to be able to score a 100% on the Connect work. You can do it as many times as you want. You just have to meet the deadlines. But there's no reason, and that's 12% of your grade. So everyone should score a 100 on that. If this class is like my other classes, everyone will not. And the primary reason is they won't meet some of the deadlines. So just FYI. SimNet work, everyone should score 100 on all the lessons. Probably not, everybody's not going to score 100 on all the projects. I haven't had anyone do that yet, but I do have people get very close. I think the highest grade I've had on the SimNet work before, I think I had somebody at a 99. I always give students the ability to, there'll be a replacement project or two that you can do in the event you miss a project or you score low on one. Those will materialize probably after this weekend, so just keep in mind. I always give students additional work. Now, the replacement projects will be more difficult. They will utilize all the skills that you've learned thus far in Excel, but there'll be an opportunity to, if you kind of find yourself in a hole and you can't get your grade above a 70 or an 80 or a 90 or whatever the metric is, you'll have the opportunity to go and do some replacement work. I have not yet, let me take a look today. I'm going to have to, over the weekend, the first day we met, I spent over 2 hours, and it was a 2-hour recording, 2 hours and 5 minutes actually. I spent over 2 hours recording basically procedures and operations for this class. And the server in Columbia lost it. What is going on here? There we go. Okay. Let's see. So I want to see if they found the recording, because I have not been notified yet. So that was 2 hours worth of instruction, and I had an interaction with a student last night, and it was quite clear that the student was not able to attend the live meeting, and therefore was not clear on some of the procedures, wasn't really clear on SimNet, wasn't too clear about Connect, things like that, because they'd not been able to attend on Monday. And of course, I don't have the recording, so and it's still not there, and I've not been notified by Columbia personnel at all. So I'm going to try, hopefully today, to go in and do some recording work, basically on SimNet, because the information, what I'm getting here, is that stuff is not there. That file is still not there. It is a 2 hour and 6 minute recording. It's 169 megs in size, and it's nowhere to be found. So something happened, and the server lost it. So just FYI, unfortunately, I've just have not been able to go back in, and had not had the time this week to go back in and recreate that information. But I will try to work on that today, go over SimNet. Basically what I'll do is I'll go back over the syllabus, procedures, and I'll go back over SimNet and Connect. And I'll make that available, send it out. I'll send out an announcement, and I'll also make it available on the course calendar. And there's actually that announcement that I just sent out. My comments are in blue. Again, for those out there seeking to maximize your grade, attendance credit is not the route to do that. The higher your grade, the less the credit. I don't say that you shouldn't try to achieve a credit. And again, I'm looking at the analytics, and I'm considering, if I have people who view asynchronously each daily meeting, they view 100% of it, then, if they do that on a daily basis, I'm considering that percentage. I award attendance credit if you attend half the live sessions. If you're viewing it asynchronously, that number is going to be higher, and that's kind of what I'm trying to decide on. What is that number going to be? It may be that it's 100%. I want you to view I want you to either attend or view everything. And if you do that, I'm trying to decide what that number is going to be. But in the meantime, as I told this student, if you're still concerned about attendance credit, then, either view or attend all class meetings. And you give yourself the best shot, or assure yourself of that credit, however amount it may be. Again, the impact of the credit is dependent on what you score on the exam. Score high on the exam, and credit is not that much. Score lower on the exam, the credit is bigger. Everybody should be seeing Blackboard. If you would, please confirm that you're seeing Blackboard. Oh, and there's Camilla. Camilla, how are you doing? Are you over in, you're over in where? You're over in Europe, aren't you? Is it Switzerland? Sweden? Oh, very good. Well, welcome. We have someone from Sweden online. Remarkable capability the internet endows us with. And we can thank the things we're going to discuss today: protocols, network protocols, Ethernet, transmission control protocol, internet protocol. Without that protocol, which has been a work in progress now, there's a guy named Vinton Cerf and Robert Metcalf, I believe, that worked on the TCP/IP protocol. And Vint Cerf is now the technology evangelist, or at least he was. He may not be now, but he was the technology evangelist at a little company called Google. And but prior to that, he worked extensively on network protocols. And we can thank him. I think George W. Bush actually awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2005. And it was because of his work on transmission control protocol, internet protocol. Oh, I forgot to mention, exam number 2 will also have Business Plugin 2 on it, business processes. So, wanted to mention, I was interacting with a student last night, and it became clear to me that the student did not realize that when you're looking at these learning modules, you can navigate to the next page. And I don't think the student was aware that this is a link to a LearnSmart module. So you click on that link and that takes you to connect directly. And of course, I'm a student, so mine looks different. But as a student, when you log in, it takes you straight to that LearnSmart lesson. So just FYI, the student wasn't very clear at that time how to get to that lesson. Son of a gun, I logged myself out. Sorry about that. Okay, learning modules. And we're in the learning modules for exam number 1. I've got 2 methods to kind of follow how this class are going. You've got the course calendar, which you have daily events corresponding to tell you kind of where we are as far as the content. And then, of course, you have the learning modules. And you see the due dates for the learning modules. Apparently, I forgot to put due dates for the rest of them, so I've got to go back and add those. So Business Plugin 5 is today. I think I have the due dates on the LearnSmart modules themselves. Let's see. Yes, I do. There they are. So I need to be consistent. We don't have due dates for the learning modules, but the LearnSmart lessons we certainly do. So anyway, you can navigate. There typically are more than one items in these learning modules, just FYI. Okay, network protocols. Bear with me just a moment. Need to do something right quick. Okay, good. I'm ready. There we go. Okay, and your screen went away for a minute. I'm going to bring it back. There you have it. Okay, if you're not seeing protocols, let me know, but that's what you should be looking at. A protocol is a set of rules for a network conversation, essentially. A good way to think of protocols to some extent is they're similar. They have some similarities to human languages. When we speak or engage with other individuals, we use mannerisms. They're kind of rules, like, for example, if someone else is talking, we should pause. It's not good to talk when other people are talking. Same thing with computers. It's not good if I've got a two-way conversation between two computers. Obviously, they both can't converse at the same time. So the protocol has rules in it for pause periods, waiting to see if there's an additional transmission, acknowledgments that you've received that information. So also the information that's being conveyed needs to be in a certain format. Typically in Ethernet, we have the structure is something called an Ethernet frame, and when we're transmitting over the internet using TCP/IP, data is organized into datagrams, and then subsequently into packets. It's broken down into packets. A good way to think about packets it's an envelope. It's got a letter in it. A datagram is the actual letter, and then the datagram gets folded into a packet. Okay, and then we transmit the packet of information. And the packets are managed individually by routers. And so think of routers as sorters in the post office. Could be mechanical sorters, could be human sorters. It goes in this box or it goes in this box, takes this line, depending on conditions on the line and the ultimate destination. This is going to East United States. This is going to Dallas Post Office, etc. So anyway, so rules. And obviously in order to communicate on a network, devices are going to have to speak the same protocol. So in order to be able to interoperate or intercommunicate, devices have to speak that protocol, so those protocols become standards. You know what a standard is? A standard is a standard mechanism or measurement. You have standards in terms of tools. You have standards in terms of building materials. A brick is a certain size, a 2x4, 2x6. Shingles are a certain size. So we have protocols. And protocols are standards. So if I'm a manufacturer of network cards, I've got to build and I build or manufacture, say, Ethernet network cards. I have to recognize that those network cards are going to have to comply with the standards associated with the Ethernet protocol. Protocols, by the way, are designed around the topology of the network. So, for example, Ethernet, if you'll recall, there's a bus network. We looked at different types of networks. We looked at a bus. We looked at a ring network, wireless networks. Where's my little pen? I need my pen. So a bus network is nothing more than a coaxial cable with terminators on each end. Terminators absorb the signal so that if a machine is transmitting over the shared wire, then when the frame reaches the end of the wire, it doesn't bounce and then go back across the network again where you get repeat traffic. That obviously would be very confusing to devices if you had electric current on this wire and these signals kept bouncing back and forth between end and end, and so packet number 35 would be intercepted if it was destined for a particular device and that device saw that packet more than once, and it would try to respond. So you would get a lot of repeat traffic on a network. So they put terminators on the end of the wires. So a bus network is a very simple structure. It's this shared wire, and we have devices that are connected to it, and they provide current and they provide the communication. And we have rules, and the rules are we have this shared common wire. And if we try to transmit at the same time, then we're going to destroy each other's communications. Because remember, this is what, at its very core, this is what a data transmission looks like. You have a sine wave. If you've ever used an oscilloscope, an electronic oscilloscope, you know you can create a sine wave through an energized wire. And so we have a signal, and this is a wavelength. Okay? Now, the way we represent data is each peak and valley, each part of that sine wave, here to here is a 1, here to here is a 1. So 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Now, and if I don't have a sine wave, that's a 0. Okay, and that's how data is represented on a network at its simplest level. That is a consistent frequency signal, at least as consistent as Mr. Smith can draw it with his poor ability to draw. And that data is being propagated over the network. Now, if two devices are communicating at the same time and they're using the same standard and they're using the same frequency, and you're gonna have collisions. You're gonna wipe out. You're gonna have collisions. So the rules in Ethernet, to some extent, are kind of simple. Device number 1, I'm gonna listen to the line, and if I don't hear anything, I'm going to transmit. And I'm going to listen to the line again and see if I detect. I'm going to wait for an acknowledgement, and if I don't receive an acknowledgement from the destination host in a certain amount of time, that meant that there was a collision relative to that particular, what we call an Ethernet frame. A frame is where think of it like an envelope, an electronic envelope. That frame was destroyed, so I'm going to retransmit. So it's called carrier sense. Collision detect, and multi-access or multiple access. So you got multiple devices accessing this wire. It's a shared wire. So we need to listen to the carrier, see if there's anyone conversing, transmit, wait for an acknowledgement. If we get an acknowledgement, it means there wasn't a collision. If we don't get an acknowledgement, it means we need to retransmit. And this is the kind of the process we go through all the time. This is the premise of Ethernet. It's how it works. And over time, we took this piece of wire and this concept, and we embedded it in a box. And we called it a hub, and it worked pretty much the same way. And you would still have collisions because everyone was kind of on the shared same, what we call the backplane, if you will, on the switch. And everybody shared the same bandwidth. And but over time, we were able to get more and more data. And then we made it smart. We made it a switch. And when we did that, then the switch was smart so that when device number 1 and 2 wanted to communicate, those two are the only two devices that there's an isolated network between those two. So there's no possibility of a collision. There are no collisions on a switch. because each communication between devices gets a virtual circuit that is isolated from all other communications. The switches are smart now. But Ethernet is premised on this original architecture, topology that you see here, the Ethernet protocol. Ethernet has a lot of advantages. The connecting equipment is relatively cheap. The network interface cards that you put in devices is relatively cheap, much cheaper than the alternative, the other mainstream alternative, which was the token ring, IBM's token ring. And so Ethernet, especially when the switches came along, when you began to get Ethernet switches that were smart and eliminated the collision possibility altogether, then all of a sudden you started seeing mass adoption of Ethernet. Ethernet is what we call a line level protocol. It's a protocol with a set of rules about how data is arranged on the electric line. It's a line, what we call a line level protocol. There are all kinds of different networks out there. Ethernet is only one, but Ethernet is quickly becoming the predominant one on most corporate networks, nonprofits, etc. Even in phone companies, a lot of your phone calls now are being transmitted at least partly over Ethernet networks in the phone company. And the reason is because the cost of the equipment's cheaper, standardization. So Ethernet has become a very important protocol for a variety of different reasons. And the networks, it's a protocol about electric signaling and bit arrangement on the physical network. It's the 802.3 standard, the Institute for Electronic and Electrical Engineers. Oh, let's see. Let me get rid of this. Why is this here? There we go. Again, it's about arranging that signal over a copper cable, a twisted pair cable, and it incorporates rules for engagement between different computers. So examples of the rules are the 5-4-3 rule. 5-4-3 rule is if you send a signal out, if you send a frame out, it has to be acknowledged within a certain amount of time, and that can be impeded by one of two things. In the past, it could be impeded if there was a collision. Remember, now we have switches and there are no collisions. The other thing that can be impeded if your cable runs are too long. For example, this building that we're in, the George building, is almost too long for Ethernet. The cable runs don't need to be over about 350 to 400. I need to look that up because I'm not sure of that number. Cat6 cable length limit, 328 feet. So you can run them 328 feet, but you can't go any further than that. And this building is almost, by the time you consider, running it up in the ceiling and everything, it's almost too long without having some kind of thing that repeats the signal. An Ethernet frame is how the data is organized. So here is an Ethernet frame. It's 1500 and I think 1528. So 7 and 1 is 8 and 6 is 14 and 6 is 20 and 22, 26. 1526 bytes of data, not bits now, bytes of data. If you want to translate that into bytes, you have to multiply it times 8. 1,528 bytes of data, or characters. And as you can see, it's like an envelope. You have a certain structure to it, including a destination address as well as where it's from, what type of data transmission it is, and that FCS at the end is actually a mathematical algorithm that is calculated before transmission as well as after transmission to make sure there's been no alteration of the data in transit. Token ring is the 8025 standard. That token ring was a ring-based topology that was developed by IBM. And with token ring, everything is transmitted in a one-directional ring. So because it all goes in one direction, there's no possibility of, and it all travels at the same speed, there's no possibility of collisions in a ring either. Token ring is the 8025 standard, and token ring has a separate set of rules. Token ring, a way of thinking about it is like a mail carrier. The mail carrier goes around the ring, and if the mail carrier has room, is not carrying data, and you got to remember this all happens in the speed of light. So this token goes around the ring, and when a device needs to transmit, it checks the token to see if it's already got data, and if it's not carrying anything, then it will add its data to the token. The token goes around until it reaches the destination, and then it sends that data. It then loads an acknowledgement that goes back around, acknowledges to that device that it received it. That device strips the acknowledgement out, adds its data back, sends it on around, and so the next part of the message goes. So a good way to think about token ring is you've got this transporter that just perpetually goes around this ring at the speed of light. It's very, very fast. It's a very elegant system, but the connecting equipment was very expensive, and the Ethernet was a lot cheaper. So ultimately, Ethernet won the day for a variety, for many different reasons in terms of being the protocol. The line level electric signaling protocol of choice. Now, TCP/IP has nothing to do with electric signaling. TCP/IP runs on top of protocols like Ethernet, like token ring, like frame relay, which is something that we will talk about later on when we talk about business services. Like point-to-point connection, these are protocols that are used by the telephone company. If you're wanting to connect, say, your headquarters to your warehouse, which is 30 miles down the road, and you're going to lease a telephone circuit, and they'll use point-to-point. A point-to-point connection protocol like X25 or something like that. TCP/IP runs on top of these kinds of protocols. It has nothing to do with how the electric signal is arranged on the line. You'd have to think of this as like a higher level of communication. For example, an example would be human beings. Human beings, in order to communicate, have to be able to communicate in a particular language. Mathematics, on the other hand, is a higher level language that all human beings can understand, whether they're understanding it in Spanish or German, or whether they're understanding it in English. Okay, it is a common language. And that's a good, I guess, somewhat of a decent analogy when you think of transmission control protocol, internet protocol. It's the technical foundation for the public internet, as well as private networks. It's an open standard. There's nobody's paying any royalties for using TCP/IP. It's open standards. It's open source supported. It's a continually evolving standard. It is important because it is the enabling protocol of the internet, and because the internet and subsequently the World Wide Web standards have become so important in the world of business. So it is the technical foundation for the public internet. And for that reason, and since almost every corporate network or nonprofit network is in some way interfaced with and utilizes the internet and integrates that internet into its overall network and information systems architecture, TCP/IP is just foundationally important all over the world. So there are lots of protocols that are associated with TCP/IP. Some of these you may have seen. These are TCP/IP protocols. FTP is a protocol for transmitting files. There are some vulnerabilities in FTP that have been symptomatic, but it was an early protocol for file transmission. SMTP is mail server to mail server file transmission. If you use a POP client like Eudora or Outlook Express, you are using the post office protocol to access mail from your Exchange server, for example. If you're using something like Outlook, that's an IMAPI client. HTTP and HTTPS, you probably are familiar with those when you go in and enter an address up in your browser, www.uscupstate.com. You'll notice that it kind of adds the HTTP or HTTPS depending on what you're doing. uscupstate.edu, let's see. I'm trying to see. Yeah, it adds the HTTPS, so it is a secure transmission between you and the USC Upstate website. The Open Systems Interconnect model. I wanted to mention this because this is kind of a reference model for designing protocols. It is not a rigid rule for how protocols should be designed. In other words, it doesn't say that all protocols should have exactly 7 layers. But protocol design is a layered approach. So, and each layer does something and then adds some control information and then hands it down to the next layer. You have two layers. You have two essential layers in the protocol stack. You have the host layer, which is where work gets done as far as preparing your Word document to be transmitted over the network. And then you have the media layer, and this is where protocols like Ethernet and Token Ring and other protocols do their work. Okay? So, you have what's called a protocol stack. And here you have the stack. So each layer does something, adds a little control information, hands it back down. Your transmission gets a little larger because you have that control information. Then you have the session, transport, network where the addressing actually occurs, and then the rules for Ethernet which, by the way, from here down is Ethernet and token ring. This is TCP/IP right here, this layer. This is where it occurs. Okay? So it's kind of complex when you're transmitting. There's a lot of work that's going on, and you're not aware of it. It seems fairly seamless to you. This happens whether you're transmitting over a phone, over a laptop, or over your desktop when you're in the lab here in the George. The Open Systems Interconnect model was developed by the International Organization for Standardization, which characterizes and standardizes the functions of a communication system in terms of these abstraction layers. So it's a pocket guide or a reference guide for designing protocols. If you're going to design a new protocol, they need to adhere to this overall architecture and design concept. Not rigidly, as you'll see. The Open Systems Interconnect model is 7 layers, and as you can see, TCP/IP is only 4. Whereas TCP/IP kind of has an application services layer and then takes some operations from sessions and transport and lumps them all under transport. And then it has the internet layer, which is equivalent to networking, and then your network interface, which is where Ethernet and token ring do their work, and that's the network interface layer. So and it depends on which one you look at. Which model, some models of TCP/IP actually have the data link in the physical. And so they actually have 5 layers. There's only 4 layers here, but most models I see have 5. TCP/IP has gone through its second iteration. There was IP version 4. Well, actually, it's gone through a number, but the major implementations was IP version 4 and IP version 6. IP version 4 has an issue. IP version 4 is a 32-bit address. So it's 32 bits. Which means that the maximum number of addresses you can get from arranging 32 bits, which each position could either have a 1 or a 0, is 2 to the 32nd power. Oh, let's see. I think it's X to Y. It's 4,294,967,296 addresses. That's it. We have well over 4 billion people on the planet now. You have millions and millions of routers. Each one of those routers represents a connection to a network, which has, each network has multitudes of hosts on it. My point is there are well over 4 billion. So the use of IP version 4, a 32-bit address, is an impediment because of the number of addresses. So there are some tricks we use and in the networking world, and I won't get into them, but we use something called network address translation. And to get more addresses. And then there's also a new version of TCP/IP that is 128. bits in length. It's called IP version 6. And it's not fully implemented yet, but when it is fully implemented, we won't ever run out of addresses, because I don't even know how big this number is, but 2 to the 128th is a very large number, as you can see. 3.40 to the 38th power. That's a huge number. So whatever that number actually is. So we won't ever use all of those addresses on the planet Earth, I don't imagine. Famous last words, but I'm saying that. Anyway, so IP version 6 has a fix for the current issue we have with addresses. There are 2 addresses if you have doesn't matter what you have, if you have a wireless device or a wired device, you have 2 addresses. You have a MAC address that you're using to connect to the connecting device. No matter what kind of connecting device you're using, no matter what kind of network it is, each connecting device has an address, and then the host that is connecting to it has a physical address. It is a physical address that is on that network interface card. Typically is hard-coded in, or you can go in and maybe it's using EEPROM and you can go in and change it. But it's typically given to it by the manufacturer, and it's unique so that there can be no 2 cards that have the same address. Because obviously you don't want a situation where I've got 2 computers and they're connecting to the connecting device and they both have the same blooming physical address. That would cause all kinds of problems. So each NIC card is manufactured. It's given a unique address that is never used in any other network interface card. And you have a network interface card, whether it's a token ring network, whether it's an Ethernet network, whether it's a fiber optic network using FDDI, whatever it is, it's got a MAC address. And if you want to know what it looks like, here's a network configuration for a machine, and as you can see, I've got it circled up here. That is a hexadecimal address, which is base 16 rather than base 2. Each position is either 1 or 0, and it represents either 0 or 16, one or the other. And that's a unique address, and it's assigned. You see it says physical address. MAC address and physical address are interchangeable because it's the physical network interface card. Now, your IP address is assigned by an administrator. It's usually done so automatically using a server that when you log in to the network, the server recognizes you, and typically it is a service running on, say, the connecting device, the switch you're connecting to, and it hands you an IP network address. And so here you have the IP address. As you can see, it says IP version 4. So it's a 32-bit address, 134.10.6.206. And that is assigned to you by a server. And it will be for the duration of the time that machine's logged in. That'll be the IP address. So you need the MAC address or the physical address for communicating with the switch. If it's an Ethernet network, you need that address for communicating with the Ethernet switch. If you're going to access web services, if you're going to navigate to another network through a router, you got to have that IP version 4 address. Okay? So, know the 2 kinds of addresses, because I'll probably ask you about that. So, the one kind of address is the MAC address, aka the physical address. Good test question. Which address is associated or considered to be the physical address? The MAC address, Media Access Control address. And then the other address is a logical address that is assigned temporarily, typically, from a queue. Server says, here you are, device you've connected to the network. Here is your IP address for the duration that you're connected. When you're done, we'll return that address to a queue and we'll reserve it for the next device that connects, and then we'll hand it back. That's the same way it works when you connect to your ISP from home. You know, if you've got an internet service provider, Charter, AT&T, whatever you're using, they do the same thing. And again, there's the IP version 4 address. You have a gateway. That's pointing you to the gateway. Of course, is the router, and then that DHCP server. That's the device that's actually giving you the TCP/IP address. I recognize you. Here's your address. Now you have the resource you need to navigate further along, leave this network, access resources over the corporate intranet, or even navigate to the internet from the corporate network to access a resource that you may need. Okay, so that's those are addresses. The two addresses you need to know about: the MAC address, media access control, and the TCP/IP address. Now let's look at some different media. Media, of course, are channels that we use to propagate network transmission. And you can have wired or wireless media. Yes, we can use radio waves of a certain characteristic to propagate data through space. We don't have to have oxygen molecules. You can propagate data through outer space where there's no air, just like you can within the atmosphere on Earth, where we actually have. You might even argue that the existence of annoying little things like oxygen are impediments to data transmissions that we propagate signal within the atmosphere. We do measure data transmission in terms of bits per second. How much data can we transmit on a network per second? For example, here in the George, and in most buildings across campus right now, I believe, I kind of keep in touch with the guys in IT, and they keep me up to speed on what's going on the networks. And speed on the networks now we're running gigabit per second networks. I think the switches are 10 gigabits per second. The network interface cards in most devices are gigabit per second. The switches are backwards compatible, so they'll accommodate both speeds. Bandwidth is a term for network capacity. How many bits per second? So when I say that we're on a gigabit network, what that means is this network is capable of propagating roughly 1 billion bits per second across it. Now, that's the capacity between the host that is connecting via a media, in this case, a cable, and the connecting device. That's that bandwidth capacity. Now, if you have two networks interconnected, then, or if your communication goes from one network to another network, the bandwidth of your communication between point A and point B, for example, if I go online and go to fast.com, and I type, okay, I want to do a bandwidth test. Now, I'm sitting in the George here, and I'm getting 39 million bits per second. That's nowhere near 1 billion bits per second. Does anybody know why I'm only getting that? Anybody want to take a guess? Why am I only getting 39 megabits per second? When I'm telling you that I'm sitting on a local area network that has a gigabit network speed. The reason I'm only getting that is because when I'm testing my speed, I'm going across a number of different networks to get to fast.com. So, for example, I'm going to trace my route and to fast.com, and you will see there's a hop, there's a hop, there's a hop, there's a hop. Looks like it's gonna stop me there. I've got 7 hops. My connection is only as fast as the slowest of those networks, because I'm hopping from one network to another network to another network, and whichever one's the slowest, that's how fast my connection is. So it doesn't matter if I'm sitting on this fast racehorse of a local area network. My bandwidth or capacity is only going to be as fast as the slowest one. And by the way, your ISP, that's the thing about your ISP. And if your ISP tells you you've got a 60-bit or 60 megabit connection to the internet, what they're telling you is the wire that they've got connecting you, they're offering you 60 megabits through their network. They make no guarantees beyond that. So, someone asked a question, could you remove a slow network to speed it up? No, you really don't have any control over that. The routers are going to route you the way they route you. So, you have a number of hops in between. This source is on the internet, so you have a number of hops in between you and the internet. That's why I don't want to say it's irrelevant. It's not. If you're given a 200 gig, let's say, I know someone who lives in Charlotte, and they've got Charter up there, and Charter will give you 200 for a price. They will sell you 200 megabits per second to the internet. Well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every resource you're accessing on the internet is going to be accessed at a 200 megabit per second rate. You could probably that person could probably do the same thing we're doing here. They've got their local area network in their home, and they point it to fast.com. And because there are a number of networks in between them and fast.com, their connection's only going to be as fast as the slowest network in between them and fast.com. So it's a little more complicated than, don't get, I don't want to tell you if you get a chance to buy, the chance to buy 200 megabits per second versus 30 or 60 megabits per second, go with the 200, especially if the price is the same. Just don't expect, and overall, by the way, you'll get better performance. But you have no guarantee of 200 megabit transmission speed for every resource you're trying to access over the extraordinarily complex network structure that comprises the internet. Because the internet is nothing more than millions of different networks interconnected through a common standard. So, you're not guaranteed that. And also other factors that come into play. If you're downloading from Netflix or YouTube, downloading videos, if the servers are busy, maybe faster, maybe slower, you may get hesitation. Even though you've got this robust connection, there are other reasons you may get slow responses. Could be related to the platform. So there's a lot of factors that come into play there. But again, your connection speed, if it traverses multiple networks, is only as fast as your slowest network. And right now, this 39 megabits, I think the issue there is probably It's one of the WAN links. It's either the WAN link between here and the main campus, or the WAN link between the main campus and Columbia. There's several WAN circuits that are slower and are probably the reason that speed is so much lower than what you would think it would be. Okay, so let's see, where are we at? Here we go. Three most common types of actual physical media are twisted pair, fiber optic, and coaxial, although coaxial is receding. Coaxial is still used extensively in the cable business because of all the installed cable that's out there. But any installed media that's being replaced, when they're replacing with fiber optic because the fiber optic has come down. Twisted pair is copper and uses electrical signal. Coaxial is copper and uses electrical signal. Coaxial has a lot more bandwidth capacity simply because it's a bigger piece of copper and supports a higher voltage. And you can get more frequencies on it. Fiber optic transmits via light. It's a glass fiber core. It transmits via light. Light is a very high frequency energy. So what that means is you get more. The reason fiber optic transmits more is very, very simple. This is a signal. It is a consistent frequency, or again, as consistent as Mr. Smith can make it, etc. 1 1 1 1 1 1 0 0 1 1 1 1 1 1 0 0. Okay? So let's say that's a signal being propagated over an electric media like twisted pair. Relatively speaking, fiber optics frequency is like this. You got so many more waves in the same amount of space. And you can get so much more data because light is such a higher frequency. Frequency is the amount of waves you can get within a certain space. And light frequencies are so much higher than, the traditional radio wave frequencies that you can just get an enormous amount of data. And if you use something called multi-mode fiber, which is you break your transmissions up and establish multiple channels through the frequency, which is what optical switches do today. So instead of just one channel of the same frequency, you would have hundreds of channels, each a slightly different frequency, and you'd be transmitting data simultaneously through all of those channels. We call that broadband, by the way. You can get a lot of data on fiber. The capacity of fiber optic, we have not made switches that can maximize or utilize all of the capacity that a fiber optic cable can transmit. Transoceanic cables, today when they lay a transoceanic cable, it's a fiber optic cable that is buried underneath, that is laid on the ocean floor. I think I was reading the other day, a lot of the tech companies, Google, Microsoft, they actually are behind. They actually are laying cable across the ocean, and it's actually a division of their business. They make money off of that. All right, let's see. It's 1:18. Why don't we take a little break? About 12 minutes. Is that okay? And then we'll come back. We'll finish this chapter. We'll move into chapter 1. And then we'll wrap things up at about 12:15. recording here. One of the platforms that I use, I take this recording of this particular class session and I then convert it into an MP4. I upload it into YouTube because YouTube has the best captioning technology available, and it captions, takes a little while to caption it. And then from YouTube, I import the video over the YouTube video. It's unpublished. I import the YouTube video over in the TechSmith. I use TechSmith for ultimately disseminating it because students have to log in and I'm capturing metrics. And those metrics are associated with your network account. So I can actually kind of tell, well, I go in, it tells me the percentage of time you, or the percentage of the video you viewed, etc. So, but yesterday I did something to the rights of the video from the class session on June the 5th, so it was inaccessible for a brief period of time. So if you tried to access the June 5th video, you were not able to access it for a brief period of time yesterday because I made it, I eliminated sharing of the video. I didn't realize I'd done that. So somebody had to point that out to me, and once I realized it, I went in and made the correction. But if you ever are not able to access a video, please let me know. Email me. I'll probably ask you some specific questions so that we can get the issue resolved. Wireless. Okay, we looked at the three wired. Wired would be coaxial, twisted pair, and fiber optic. Those are the predominant wired media out there. Two are electrical. By the way, one more thing I wanted to mention about fiber optic. The nice thing about fiber optic is if I've got this big giant warehouse and I've got a little office on the back side of the warehouse, I can run a fiber optic cable through the roof of that building all the way to the other end and then connect it to the, if my headquarters is on the, connected to the other side of the building. I can use fiber optic, and I don't have to worry about electromagnetic interference. Copper cable, which typically is not shielded, by that I mean it doesn't have any sort of protection. It matters where you run copper cable. For example, a simple example would be if you run copper cable in a building, you should never run it near fluorescent lights because fluorescent lights emit electromagnetic interference, those ballasts and those lights do, and they can actually damage or interfere with data transmissions over that copper cable. If it's fiber optic, it doesn't matter. Light is a completely different frequency, different form of energy. It is not susceptible to EMI, electromagnetic interference. Copper, on the other hand, don't put it near machinery. I know of a case where a consultant went into a bank and somebody had run a copper cable near one of those, an electronic pencil sharpener, or somebody had put an electronic pencil sharpener near the cable, and when they sharpened the pencils, it interfered and damaged transmission going over the wire. So just FYI. Fiber optic also will transmit a little further before you actually have to renew the signal. For example, Ethernet cable, 328 feet, fiber optic cable 27 miles before you actually have to repeat it. Wireless communications. You've had different wireless technologies over years. Infrared uses red light, which really is kind of invisible. If you want to know technologies that use infrared, point of sale scanning systems, your remote control to your TV. They're either infrared or radio wave, one or the other. There actually have been infrared local area networks, LANs, like wireless infrared. The problem is with infrared is it's line of sight. Typically, you've got to be able to see it. It's not like radio waves. Infrared, for example, if somebody stands in between you and the television and you're sitting there trying to change the channel, you can't change the channel because that infrared light won't go around you. So infrared has some problems, obviously, when it comes to networking. Bluetooth is a radio wave-based network transmission technology. It's mainly it's a short distance, short range networking technology. So in other words, we don't really have Bluetooth networks. We use Bluetooth primarily as a connecting protocol. So we want to connect our phone to the speaker in our house, or the speakers, these Bose speakers we want to connect with our digital stereos. So we're going to use Bluetooth. So it's a way of wirelessly connecting peripheral or devices to other. We connect our phone to our car, our automobile, using Bluetooth. Bluetooth is used heavily in the automotive industry. So it's typically short range. Wi-Fi, on the other hand, is a LAN technology, local area network. Most corporate buildings now extend their network via Wi-Fi networks because of the mobility advantage. For example, here, the university has 3 Wi-Fi networks. One extended to students, one extended to guests, and one extended to staff and university personnel. Wi-Fi is an evolving standard. I first remember using Wi-Fi like in the very, very early 90s. The 802.11 standard was 10 megabits per second. Now Wi-Fi is over 10 gigabits per second. The latest standard is. My information's a bit dated here. It's really not clear, as far as we know, these radio waves don't damage our standards, but the way the American economy works is we don't really do long-term studies on new technologies, and so nobody really knows what the long-term effects of human exposure to all these signals are. Typically, energy waves like that, it depends on the intensity of the energy, the amount of energy, and the frequency. A more high-powered transmission source is microwave. If you travel on the interstate, and typically you'll see these microwave towers on top of mountains, and if they're pointed kind of horizontally, that's a terrestrial microwave transmission. You've got somewhere on the receiving end 30, 40, 50 miles away, depending on how up the tower is, you've got another tower that's receiving a transmission from that microwave. If you've ever seen these satellites on top of like convenience stores, those are called VSAT satellites, or very simple aperture terminals, VSAT, and they're pointing to a satellite, and typically those VSAT satellites use satellite connections to connect that store back to the corporate office. So satellite and usually it's not a high bandwidth, they're just transmitting data, point of sale data, that kind of information. Satellites are, we'll talk more about them in terms of wireless, but they're another option. The cost of satellites is coming down, the size of satellites is coming down, the cost of putting them up into space is coming down. So satellites are another wireless option. There actually are companies going into the business of offering satellite-based broadband, which brings us to broadband. I've already mentioned broadband before. We need to know what broadband is. Broadband is a high-capacity telecommunications channel or line that is capable of providing high-speed internet or network service. So it's not limited to just internet. For example, the university's network uses broadband technology. You're able to get a gigabit of data transmission speed on the local area network in this building, as well as other buildings on the university, through broadband technology. Those switches that are the connecting devices employ broadband technology to achieve the bandwidth levels that they're able to deliver. The network interface cards in the transmitting devices, whether it's a computer, whether it's a laptop, they employ broadband technologies as well. Broadband can be dispensed or delivered over wired media. They can also be dispensed or delivered over wireless media. You know, every iteration of Wi-Fi has higher bandwidth transmission capacity. Why? Because the network interface cards and the connecting devices, the wireless access points, employ improving broadband connection capabilities. And a simple model of what broadband is the ability to establish through the communications media, whether it's air, whether it's fiber optic, or whether it's copper, the ability to establish multiple channels through that media and to send data across each one of those channels. So the way to think about improving broadband rates, you're getting more channels. Now, this very simple model here has only 4 channels. If I ask you what broadband is on the exam, please do not tell me that it is the ability of a switch to establish 4 channels through the media. This is just an example. Broadband uses a variety of different techniques. This is not a networking class. I don't want to get into how it establishes those channels. It establishes those channels by varying the frequencies of each channel. It establishes the channels by varying the phase and the frequency of those channels. And it establishes channels by varying amplitude. So you can take the same frequency and vary the amplitude and the phase, and you can have different channels based on those characteristics. And so, you know, it's not just 4 channels, it's hundreds, if not thousands of channels transmitting simultaneously through the media. And the more channels you have, the more data you get through it. So broadband is a high capacity telecommunications channel or line, which may be a physical line and it may be wireless. Okay, but it's employing broadband techniques. If you've ever had the joy of using a phone modem, that is a modulator-demodulator, and the phone line, if you have now most of you probably have a wireless phone. You may have done away with your physical phone in your home. And there are different kinds of modems today. There are cable modems, there are DSL modems, there are phone modems. A phone modem is associated with a dial-up connection. So if you were an old AOL connector, your ISP offered you the ability to dial in using a modem connection, and your modem would modulate and it would connect with another modem, and it would connect at a speed because a phone line, that phone switch has a limited bandwidth capacity of 64 kilobits. You can't get any more than that on that phone line. Actually, you won't get that much. You'll get about 56 is about the best you'll get. I can remember when I used to actually use modems, and I had a US Robotics modem, and I would connect to the internet at 56 kilobits per second. And I thought that was just smoking at the time, of course. And people would grind their teeth today trying to access the internet at 56 kilobits per second. Fax machines employ modems. If you have a fax machine, those fax machines connect with other fax machines, and they modulate that signal and they send a graphical depiction. They break it up into a digital transmission, and they transmit it over the modem line using a structured signal. Like this. Okay? Using a structured signal through a phone, a phone line. If you've ever heard two modems connect, then they go, A phone modem is a last mile technology. When I say last mile, it's using that copper cable that lies between a residence and or a business and the phone switch. That installed copper cable has a maximum bandwidth, maximum voltage. It won't support any more voltage or bandwidth. It's an RJ11 cable, and it is pervasive around the country. And when you get into rural areas, it's often the only option. There actually are still places in the United States where the only thing you can get is dial-up or satellite. For example, if you're in Alaska, there are some areas in Alaska where you're only going to get dial-up or satellite. If you're out in the Midwest, and some of the rural states, western states, dial-up or satellite. You might not have a cable provider out there. Last mile technology is a term I want you to remember. I want you to remember that the last mile is that copper wire. Because, when the telecommunications infrastructure was installed, this was, of course, back when phone companies were public utilities, and they were tasked with making sure that everyone had a phone in the lower 48. And, of course, that's been extended to Alaska and Hawaii, obviously, but that copper cable and that infrastructure and that corresponding switch, depending on where you are, if you're in a very rural area, it doesn't change much, and it's a limitation to being able to deliver broadband services because you can't get much data through that channel. That's a big deal. Now, we've developed some innovative ways. For example, digital subscriber line is another last mile technology that takes advantage of the bandwidth on that wire that the phone call doesn't use. Phone call uses from 0 to 3200 gigahertz for voice, and then above that, there's some more bandwidth, and that's what DSL uses. So if you've ever had DSL in your home, you know that you kind of have to put filters in the jacks, and that's to prevent that when you pick the phone up from hearing that higher frequency data transmission. Usually with DSL, about the best you're going to get is around 24 megabits. What is it? You got AT&T Uverse. AT&T Uverse is in some places, if you're in a city, AT&T is extending satellite services. In other places, they tell you it's AT&T Uverse, but it's not. It's actually DSL or ADSL. And if you're about a mile and a half from the switch or less, you can get up to 24 megabits per second download speed using that service. It doesn't matter how far you are from the switch, because remember that line is, the capacity of that line further distances drop down. So you got to be about a little over 3 miles from the switch or less. If it's ADSL2 standard, 24 megs, you got to be within a mile and a half, roughly. But again, DSL, another last mile technology. It depends on that phone line. Cable is not a last mile technology. Cable comes in on an installed coaxial cable. The DSL in the United States, I wanted to mention, is typically asynchronous, not too much upload speed, a lot of download speed. Europe, it's kind of equal both ways, upload and download. Cable has higher bandwidth primarily because of medium use. Coaxial cable's got a lot more bandwidth capacity than for example, coaxial. It's a mathematical formula. You got to calculate it. It's over a gigabit per second on a coaxial cable. So I don't know. I can't find the exact amount. You actually have to calculate it. There's a mathematical formula for calculating what it is. It depends on the size of that core. If you have a coaxial cable called ThinNet, it's going to have less capacity than a bigger coaxial cable. So I'll try to find out what that is, what that capacity is. All right, so but coaxial comes in, and cable companies today typically use either fiber or they use the coaxial cable. Again, satellites, typically there's a satellite modem because the signal has to be transmitted from the TV, or the television into a form that when you send it to that mounted satellite on the side of your home or your business, top of your business, it's gonna send it in a digital form to the satellite. It's gonna hit the transponder on that satellite. That satellite's gonna beacon it back down. It's a triangulation operation. These are just some different satellites, services, if you will: Dish, Hughes, Wild Blue, Exceed. The problem with satellite transmission typically is most of those satellites, or depends on the service, but if you've got a stationary disk and it's pointed to a certain azimuth and altitude in the sky, then that satellite never moves. That's called a geostationary satellite. That satellite is 22,600 miles up. And it is over the equator. That is some very valuable real estate there, because if you put a satellite over the equator at 22,600 miles up, then it will stay right there and never move. It doesn't circulate around the planet. It stays locked in position relative to the surface of the Earth. I can't explain the physics of it to you, but I'm just telling you this is how it works. That satellite, if you're transmitting to that satellite, you got a 500, 700 millisecond delay between when you send and when you receive it. So gaming, anything that require, or voice over IP, talking with someone, you get a delay on those transmissions. So time-sensitive transmissions, that's an issue. Again, companies are now starting to deploy if you will, arrays of satellites that are low Earth orbit satellites, LEO satellites. These are about 600 miles up. That delay is much, much less. That latency is much, much less. Really not even relevant. And that satellite has navigation ability. It can actually act like a geosynchronous satellite because it actually has a power source, and it can stay in one place, kind of hover, if you will. Or they have an array of satellites that actually cover the globe. And as those satellites rotate around, you're handed off from one satellite to the next for the service as it goes around. There is a phone service called Iridium that works like this. It uses low Earth orbit satellites. It's an array of satellites. It's for purposes of phone communications. And it was first implemented by the military, and those are LEO satellites, and they circulate around. They maintain the same relative position to each other, and as they go around the Earth, they maintain constant coverage of anywhere on the Earth. And if you're on top of K2, which is a mountain in the Himalayas, and you've got one of these phones, you can make a phone call using that satellite. E-business networks. These are lease solutions. There are many times companies have to lease networks because they don't own the land. They can't, you can't bury a network. I mean, if you're connecting two states, clearly you've got to lease some sort of solution, whether it's microwave or traditional telecommunications. So these are solutions for connecting locations. And you typically lease them from telecommunications providers. And there's just a whole array of companies. This is their business. They provide communication services and connectivity. And so the goal is, you need something that provides transparent exchange and that your existing network technology will work over. In other words, you'd like to avoid translating from one network. If you're connecting two TCP/IP networks, I'd like for TCP/IP to work. I don't want to have to translate to a different network type and then translate for TCP/IP back. So I'd like for TCP/IP to work over that network if I've got two TCP/IP networks that I'm connecting. So I also want to be able to securely exchange information. I don't want to, if I'm sharing a network with a bunch, if I'm leasing communication from another company, I want to be sure that my communications are exclusive to me, protected, and these providers can provide things like VPNs or virtual private networks that isolate my communications. No one else has access to them, has the possibility of interacting. I want end-to-end integration. If I am at a third party, if I'm at a remote site and I want to access my ERP functionality, I can do so seamlessly. It acts just like my network. I may be leasing it, and I may be interconnecting the two locations with a third party, but I don't know it. When I click on my desktop, my ERP system comes up just like I was on that network. No difference. If, for example, my population in a building varies significantly. At night, I don't need a lot of bandwidth. In the morning, when all 500 workers report, the bandwidth needs to go up, and I need that network connection to scale. It's called a scalable network link. I want it to scale up, and they'll provide that. So, again, I want to lease a third-party connection, but as far as the end user, they have no knowledge whatsoever that we have a leased line that is not part of this organization, that is maintained, provided, and managed by a third-party carrier. They know nothing about that. So these are all examples, some examples. You can lease business lines from companies like Level 3 Communications or Verizon. There are hundreds of companies in the communications business. You can lease a T1 line, AT&T, a DS3, and they're just different categories. I'm not really interested in you memorizing them. I'm just showing you a DS3 is 45 megabits and OC3 is 156 megabits per second. You can take these circuits and using equipment on both ends, kind of divide it up and say, okay, this is voice. Typically today, though, what companies do, it's all digital, and their phone calls are transmitted digitally just like their communications. Frame relay and ATM are scalable cloud-based technologies. You know how the internet's kind of like a big cloud of networks? Well, telecommunications providers are big clouds of networks as well. So AT&T has network infrastructure, for example, in every major city in the United States. So if you had a business that had offices and or facilities in every major city in the United States, or almost every one of them, you could go to AT&T and say, I'd like to use frame relay or ATM, and I want to connect locally in every city. I want to connect to AT&T's infrastructure locally in every one of those cities. Because the reason you want to do that is those local connections are very short, and they don't cost a lot. And even if you get a lot of bandwidth, they don't cost as much money. Where these circuits get expensive is if you have let's say you have a dedicated circuit, and you're connecting Seattle to Atlanta. That's a long circuit. That's 3,000 miles roughly. And let's say you want 20 megabits. That circuit would cost you $40,000 a month. I have no idea. I'm just pulling that number out. But I know, for example, the university has one circuit that it leases, and it's a 20 meg circuit, and it's 8 miles, and it's $1,000 a month. So you can imagine the cost of the circuit varies by the distance, and it varies by the amount of bandwidth. So AT&T and ATM and frame relay are cloud-based, where you connect to you have a virtual connection through the maze of networks that is AT&T or is Verizon or whatever the provider is, and they route you through their network infrastructure so that I can connect all these cities, and every one of my locations in these cities, they connect locally. They have an interface, a local interface. They're a very short local connection, and they connect in that city, and then AT&T, through its network infrastructure, isolates the traffic and routes it through their network cloud so that all of these locations here can connect to headquarters here. We'll call this HQ, through a cloud. And these are all, there's a cost to frame relay. It's expensive, but it would not be as expensive as if each one of these were major cities, and each one of these cable runs, this was 1,000 miles, 2,500, 500, 1,600 miles, and so forth, all running to the corporate office. So frame relay is expensive, but the more locations you have, the more sense it makes to use some kind of visual circuit, some kind of virtual circuit-based system which allows for local connections of all these locations, and then virtual circuit connections or VC connections through the service provider, Verizon, AT&T, Level 3 Communications, whatever, actually to headquarters. Is everybody clear on that? What business services like Frame Relay and AT&T are? There's a larger base cost for these, but again, it's a lot cheaper to use these virtual circuits to interconnect than it is to use, once you get a lot of locations. Once you get a lot of locations, those long cable runs with bandwidth requirements, they add up very, very quickly. So you're not paying for those long cable runs. So just in summary, modem, slow, last mile technology if it's a phone modem. If it's a cable modem or DSL modem, DSL modem last mile. Cable modem, different medium. DSL and cable faster, but cable and DSL not necessarily available in all places. There are places in South Carolina you can't get DSL, believe it or not. I mentioned ISDN. Don't worry about that. That's another technology. I think DSL's kind of left it behind. ISDN stands for Integrated Systems Digital Network. Cable, satellite, modems, or cable uses coax or fiber. Satellite obviously uses microwave transmission. With satellite, depending on the kind of satellite, and even if they are the low satellites, you're still going to have some delay, but you're going to have significant delay if it's those geosynchronous satellites that are, 22,000 miles up. Options are also you can use circuits leased from telecommunications providers. There's a high cost. It's based on mileage and bandwidth. More mileage and bandwidth, the higher the cost of the circuit. Frame relay and ATM, a higher initial cost, but as you scale and add more and more locations, it makes sense to use these virtual circuit technologies because ultimately it'll be a lot cheaper than using the dedicated circuits. Some other innovations. A lot of companies doing this now. Everything's moving digital. So if you are using, again, I mentioned if you use a public telecommunications infrastructure, in other words, you're leasing communications services from AT&T. They're providing you with an OC3, or maybe you're using Frame Relay. Then you want to make sure all of your communications, your data and voice communications are private, can't be intercepted. They will offer you a VPN, which basically is an encrypted transmission through their network infrastructure. If you have workers working remotely, or they work from home 3 days a week, you let your salespeople work. Your salespeople are either working remotely from hotels or in their home. They connect every day. They connect to the corporate portal and upload their sales information. You want to do that securely. So you put some VPN software there, and when they connect to a VPN server that establishes a secure tunnel through the internet, because the internet is not, let me reiterate this, is not a secure network environment. So it establishes a VPN through the internet. They connect to the internet through the Wi-Fi network in the hotel, or the coffee shop where they are, or their home office, the wireless network they have in their home, which is then connected to the internet through their DSL modem or a cable modem. Then they have a VPN client on their laptop. They initiate that VPN client upon connecting. It connects to the server, the corporate server. That establishes a VPN tunnel through the internet. Now they can transmit. Now they can access the corporate portal. There is no concern whatsoever now that anything they transmit can be intercepted. My brother's in the banking business, and he occasionally works from home. And anytime he accesses banking systems, he cannot do it without implementing his VPN software. It's a requirement, security requirement. VAN, a value-added network, is some network service. A lot of telecommunications providers are in the business of adding, they add additional services. VPN services are one. Another one is they might manage your email. They provide burstable networks, that is, they can scale up. So they add some sort of value to the network service that they offer. Oh, now what happened there? Okay. I don't know how I got right there. That is annoying. Okay. Because I hit that blue line. That's what happened. That's where I am. All right. Here's an example where a customer is offering something called EDI, electronic data interchange. And so that might be a value added. And it's a way for two trading partners or even a company, if they want to transmit data in EDI format between systems, they can use EDI services. Voice over IP. Most organizations are now propagating their voice calls over the same network that their data propagates over. The University of South Carolina, probably 7-8 years ago, went to voice over IP. Basically, what it means is you no longer have two networks, one for voice with devices or hosts that are designed to operate over that network and interact with that switch. Now everything is transmitted over an IP network, and your switch is a server. It's a computer, essentially. So the phones in the University of South Carolina, the faculty phones, they're IP-based phones. You plug them up. They have an IP address. When they authenticate, a DHCP server hands them. Actually, they have a hard-coded IP address. So they're administered. That address doesn't change. Which means that you can change offices, take the phone with you, and it'll automatically work. Calls automatically get routed to you. You don't have to reprogram the switch because you have the same IP address with the phone. If you're in office 356 in one building and then you move to office 200 in another building, you're going to get the phone calls. They don't have to reprogram the switch, which is kind of nice. There's enormous savings there are significant savings in administrative costs because voice and data are propagated over the same network and the same administrator can manage both. As a matter of fact, I know the individual who manages the phone system on this campus, and that individual is also in charge of other servers as well. He is a server administrator, and he manages both data services servers as well as the phone servers. So the university has gleaned savings in terms of administrative costs. Well, I knew I'm dating myself, but I actually knew the person who was the phone system administrator when we had the old public service telephone network, or we had the old private branch exchange. It's called a PBX. And it was an old electronic switch. And when that gentleman retired, the university didn't replace that individual. There are some issues, but typically on the campus area network, you can control phone quality. Where you run into jitter with a phone call. And by the way, occasionally on our network, my phone call will drop. Happens about twice a year. There's no explanation. And I believe it's related to an event on the data network, maybe the router. It doesn't happen very often. I don't experience latency, jitter, packet loss. Those things can be resolved. The network administrator uses something called virtual private networks. So phone calls on the university network are isolated in a VPN, and they're managed at the router level so that they're guaranteed bandwidth. So if you're a network administrator and you have control of the network, over the entire network, doesn't matter if it's a WAN that spans the globe. If you have control of that network, you can manage latency and packet loss, jittery issues on the phone. It's when you lose control, when it crosses third-party networks, things like that, where there might be issues that are outside of your purview or control as a network administrator. So there can be some difficulty, but most companies today, if they haven't migrated their voice communications to the IP network, they're in the process of doing so. There are enormous savings to be had. For example, if you've got phone calls going between Europe and the United States, why not have a data circuit? Lease a certain amount of bandwidth from a transoceanic circuit provider and just propagate your phone calls in between. You hit a number, hit an extension, and you're in the London office accessing someone. Boom, there it is. It's going over an IP network. There's no calls, nothing's being paid. You're paying for the data circuit, but you're not paying for those individual phone calls. You're just paying for data. Those phone calls are being routed through an internal phone system. And by the way, if you're calling someone in London and you're in the United States, here's how it works. Pick up the phone, make the call. It gets routed through the corporate network to London, and then it leaves the corporate network from London. It's a local phone call. You don't make a long distance call, transoceanic call. It's a local phone call. So there are issues with voice over IP. Most of them can be managed if you have control of the network. One of the issues is power. Believe it or not, your local phone system has a separate power typically. So if you've ever been in a snow event in South Carolina, then you know that sometimes you might actually still have phone service and you won't have power in your home or in your office. Because, if heaven forbid, if we get precipitation and it freezes, the world comes to an end in South Carolina because we don't have equipment to do anything with it. Alrighty, so that concludes the networking chapter. We've got 2 chapters that we'll go over on Monday. Chapters 1 and 2. We'll have time to complete both of those. I encourage you to read them ahead of time. Chapter 1 is business-driven technology. It's really just the introductory chapter of the text. It talks about management information systems. We talk about the characteristics of information. Chapter 2, we talk about the focus of information systems, which is to enhance or create competitive advantage. We look at some different models, many of them by a gentleman named Michael Porter, who created them as methods for identifying competitive advantage. So we'll have time to go over all of that, and then we'll have our first exam on Tuesday. Now, you'll notice on the course calendar, I'd like to point out, I'll have about an hour of class. I will not have more than an hour. I'll have an hour of class on exam day. So because typically the exam shouldn't take you more than an hour and 15 minutes. And as a matter of fact, when you'll note when you, I'm going to go ahead and let you know now, when I deliver exams, they are timed. I have a formula that I follow. I've established it over the years. It's pretty reliable. It's a control mechanism. You do not have unlimited amounts of time to take the exam. And, I'm not naive and don't recognize that some people may have reference material when they're taking the exam. I understand that. But you need to understand that the exam is going to be timed. The questions are going to be presented one at a time. And you are not going to have time to reference everything you need in order to complete that exam. Just letting you know now. Okay? I see a question someone's asking, is the exam at 10? The exam is all day long. And Camilla, you're in Sweden, so you need to make adjustments there. The exam will be available from 12 a.m. Tuesday morning till 12 p.m. or till 11:59 p.m. Tuesday night. Now, and when I say 11:59 p.m., I mean it. It disappears at 11:59 p.m. The link will disappear. As long as you start the exam before 11:59 p.m., you're okay. I would not wait that long, because the way the exam is set up is if let's say you get kicked off your machine, something goes wrong, you've got something wrong with your machine, it just all of a sudden reboots. You lose 5 minutes, but the exam is set up so that you can go back into the exam. Okay, but the timer keeps running. In other words, once you implement the exam, the timer is running and it doesn't stop. I can't tell you exactly how the exam is going to be. Typically, the exam time is anywhere from, usually it's going to be 75 to 80 minutes that you have. Or maybe even 85. It just depends on the number of questions. I'll tell you the formula. You get 1 minute for each true, false, multiple choice, and you get 5 minutes for each short answer, and they're going to be short answers. And you should be able to answer any of my short answer questions in less than 5 minutes. So depending on the exam itself, it's going to be anywhere from 75 to 85 minutes. That'll be allocated for it. Once that time is up, it stops. It will automatically log you out, and that will be it. So you should be aware of that. If you have some sort of disability and a timed exam is an issue for you, then you need to. That's a disability services issue. You should talk with them about that. And whatever they tell me I need to do, then I'm happy to do. I'll comply with whatever they tell me needs to be done. But those are my main controls. Main control is one question at a time, and then the other main control is the amount of time that you actually have. And I have some questions. Somebody's asking me how many questions. I'm not quite sure. It's going to be anywhere from 60 to 65 to 67 questions. Usually with short answer, the way that I structure the exam, I will give you 7 or 8 short answer questions, and I'll ask you to answer 5. So you get a choice. Now that's a little difficult to navigate. You have to be aware of that as you're navigating the exam. You can go back and forth between the questions, but since it's one question at a time, one of the things you might want to do when you're taking the exam is make a note which number exams are the short answer, because I do scramble them. Let me be very clear about that. That's another control. No students can sit together and take the exam side by side, you won't get the same questions. The questions are scrambled by students. So that's not possible as well. So anyway, those are the main controls. I will tell you, if you something happens, you're kicked out and you can't get back to the exam, you need to let me know as soon as possible. My solution typically involves this. I'm given a certain amount of information. So if you get kicked out, I want to know ASAP. You send me an email. That is, of course, if you can't immediately go back in. I want to know as soon as possible. I'll take information included in your email and information that I get from the testing software in Blackboard itself, and I'll comprise a timeline from that. I take a look at the questions you've done. What I typically do is I take the answers you've already completed, I export them out, and they're part of your work, and then I give you the questions that are remaining with the time that I determine that you have left. Okay, so that's how I deal with that. So anyway, just FYI, that's some of my approach to online testing. So anyway, let's go ahead and take the roll. And I hope everyone has a good weekend. Make use of your time over the weekend. Let's prepare for, thoroughly prepare for these exams. And, this material is kind of dry. This is not something you want to do. This is not something you want to prepare for at the last minute. This is a class you want to systemically prepare for these exams. On Monday night, you should be, 2 or 3 hours at most. You should be ready by then. You should be reviewing this. You should be spending an hour and a half, 2 hours a day on this class. And then on Tuesday, you're ready. You got an hour and a half, 2 hours of preparation, and you're ready to go. Okay. Have a good weekend, everyone. Camilla, how's the weather in Sweden? Somebody had told me to ask you that. Oh, very nice. Good. Wonderful. All right. Well, enjoy your weekend over there. It's a beautiful country. I've not been to Sweden yet. I want to travel to Sweden. Going to come over there and taste the chocolate for sure. And I understand you have some wonderful trains out there. I want to ride some of the trains they have in Sweden. Yes, I will. I love the Nordic countries. I love Sweden, Switzerland, Finland, Norway. All right, everyone. Have a good weekend. We will see you on Monday. Chapters 1 and 2. Be sure and read those chapters beforehand. If you think of any questions you might have between now and Monday, please, you can email me, post them in the discussion board. Nobody's used the discussion board yet. Also, if you haven't completed the survey, let's see, in Blackboard, please do so. And send me the number of correct answers. Go in and look at, if you would, I'll send that announcement to this effect. But go in, if you've posted a string, I've got 13 participants in here so far. On your introduction icebreakers, send me the number of correct answers. Let me know. Or let's see. Send me the number of people who correctly identified the lie. Okay? For each of your threads. Okay.